All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be focusing on something a bit different, but hopefully you'll find it just as interesting.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, this one is, well, I guess it's kind of tailor-made for you. As a philosopher, I think you're going to find this one especially fascinating.
All right, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So we're going to be diving deep into the world of Al-Kindi.
Al-Kindi. Okay, so we're talking early Islamic philosophy here.
You got it. Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, to be precise.
Now, that's a name I haven't heard in a while. What makes him so special for this deep dive?
Well, you see, he's considered the first self-identified philosopher in the Arabic tradition. That's a pretty significant title, right?
Oh, absolutely. A true pioneer. It's always fascinating to explore those figures who lay the groundwork for entire intellectual traditions.
And to really get into the nitty-gritty, we're going to be pulling most of our insights from the Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy's entry on him. Should be a pretty solid foundation.
Sounds like a good starting point. Though, honestly, any deep dive into early Islamic philosophy kind of feels like stepping into a whole new world, wouldn't you say?
Oh, for sure. But that's what makes it so exciting, right?
Definitely. It challenges our assumptions, pushes us to see familiar philosophical problems from completely different angles. I mean, just think about the context. 9th century Baghdad. This was a period of intense intellectual ferment, a real melting pot of ideas. The translation movement was in full swing, bringing Greek philosophical and scientific texts into the Arabic-speaking world. And Al-Kindi, as I recall, was smack dab in the middle of it all.
Exactly. It's like imagine being surrounded by all these newly translated works, the rush of grappling with ideas from a totally different culture and intellectual tradition. And he wasn't just passively absorbing these texts either. He was leading one of the main translation circuit.
Really driving that intellectual exchange, bridging those worlds, that's fascinating.
Oh, and get this. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry mentions that he came from a pretty prominent Arab tribe, the Kindi tribe, and this lineage actually earned him the title of Philosopher of the Arabs.
Philosopher of the Arabs, huh? That's quite the moniker. It suggests he wasn't simply adopting Greek philosophy wholesale, but was engaging with it from a distinctly Arab perspective, bringing his own cultural and intellectual background to the table. I'd imagine that would be a crucial aspect for a philosopher to consider this interplay of different intellectual traditions.
Definitely something to keep in mind. And the entry also mentions that he had strong ties to the ruling elite. He was a scholar under the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mamun. And get this, he was even a close associate of Al-Mutasim and tutored his son.
Oh, wow. So we're talking about a scholar who was deeply embedded in the intellectual and political landscape of his time. Having that kind of patronage must have been so crucial for supporting his scholarship.
For sure. And let's not forget about his own writing. I mean, the guy was prolific. The Fihrist of Ibn al-Nadim, which is basically a 10th century bibliography, credits him with writing, get this, hundreds of treatises. I can't even imagine the sheer amount of work that went into all that.
Hundreds of treatises. That's well, it's pretty astounding. It speaks to the breadth of his intellectual curiosity, and it kind of makes you wonder, what would the history of philosophy look like if we had access to all of those lost works? Sadly, many of them haven't survived the test of time.
I know, right? It's a shame we've lost so much. But thankfully, we still have some really crucial texts. There's this manuscript in Istanbul that's basically a gold mine. It contains many of his philosophical works, including his big one on first philosophy.
On first philosophy, I mean, the title itself kind of screams, this is important stuff, and I'd wager it also contains his On the Intellect, which is a really significant text for understanding his psychological theories.
Yeah, it's like having a direct window into his philosophical system. And speaking of influences, I think it's fair to say Greek philosophy had a pretty big impact on him, wouldn't you say?
It's hard to imagine it not having a major influence. I mean, he's leading these translation efforts, he's surrounded by these texts, he's breathing in this Greek intellectual air. But the entry makes an interesting point. It says that while his thought is definitely suffused with Neoplatonism, which makes sense considering the whole one from which all reality emanates, the entry emphasizes that Aristotle was considered his main authority in philosophical matters.
So Aristotle over, say, Plotinus or Proclus. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of a reminder that these categories, Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism, were still very much in flux during this period. Thinkers were drawing from various sources, weaving them together in new and creative ways.
For not just boxes you can neatly fit people into.
Exactly. And Al-Kindi even wrote a whole treatise called On the Quantity of Aristotle's Books.
On the quantity. So what, like a book review?
Not exactly. It's actually more of a comprehensive overview of all of Aristotle's works, or at least all of them that were known at the time. It gives us a really good sense of the scope of his engagement with Aristotle's thought, which seems to have been pretty extensive.
Okay, but here's where things get a little more interesting, especially for a philosopher like you.
All right, I'm all ears.
So the entry describes his summary of Aristotle's metaphysics as rather surprising.
Surprising, huh? How so?
Well, it seems that instead of taking Aristotle's being as the main point of departure, Al-Kindi kind of goes in a different direction.
What, like a theological direction? That wouldn't be entirely unexpected given the context.
Bingo. He interprets it through a theological lens, focusing on things like proving the existence of God, affirming his oneness, and understanding how he acts as the efficient cause of the universe. Like he's saying, the point of metaphysics is to explain God and creation.
That is an interesting take. It really highlights that shift in focus we see in a lot of early Islamic philosophy, this merging of metaphysics and theology, a blending of philosophical inquiry with religious belief.
And this isn't just some side note either. The entry makes it clear that this theological interpretation was super important for integrating Greek philosophical ideas into Islamic thought, basically setting the stage for how philosophy was going to be done in this new context.
I see. So it's not just about understanding Al-Kindi's personal interpretation, it's about how that interpretation shaped the very trajectory of philosophical discourse within this emerging tradition.
Exactly. It was like laying the groundwork for what philosophy would even mean in this new intellectual landscape. And if you look at the beginning of, it's on First Philosophy, you can see this right away. He defines first philosophy, which is basically what we call metaphysics, as the knowledge of the first truth who is the cause of all truth. He's basically saying to understand ultimate reality, you got to understand God.
It's a powerful statement. He's linking being and truth, metaphysics and theology right from the get-go. And this blurring of boundaries between philosophical and theological discourse becomes a recurring theme in Islamic philosophy, doesn't it?
Totally. It's like these two ways of thinking, philosophy and theology, are constantly in dialogue, influencing and enriching each other. And of course, we can't forget the Neoplatonic influence we talked about earlier. The entry specifically mentions thinkers like Proclus, whose ideas about the true one Al-Kindi seems to draw from, and that super influential text, The Theology of Aristotle.
The Theology of Aristotle, that's actually a bit of a misnomer, right? I mean, it's really a translation of Plotinus, adapted and presented as if it were by Aristotle. Talk about a tangled web of influences.
Oh, it gets even more tangled. Remember John Philoponus?
The Christian Neoplatonist. Yeah, what about him?
The entry brings him up as a big influence, particularly when it comes to Al-Kindi's arguments against the eternity of the world.
Ah, yes. That was a major sticking point, wasn't it? I mean, you've got Aristotle over here saying the world has always existed, and then you have the Abrahamic traditions with their creation narratives.
Yeah, definitely a philosophical and theological clash. And it seems like Al-Kindi, siding with Philoponus, is trying to make a case for creation ex nihilo, that the world had a beginning in time.
And he wasn't afraid to draw on thinkers from different backgrounds to make his case, even if it meant challenging some of the biggest names in Greek philosophy. Which, speaking of which, there's this fantastic quote from Al-Kindi that really captures his open-minded approach to knowledge.
Oh yeah, what was it again?
It's something along the lines of, we should never be ashamed to acknowledge and embrace truth, no matter where it comes from, even from far-flung nations and foreign peoples.
It's a powerful statement, a real testament to intellectual humility and a commitment to truth above all else. It suggests that for Al-Kindi, the pursuit of knowledge wasn't about clinging to any particular tradition or dogma, but about following the truth wherever it might lead, regardless of its origin.
Absolutely. And this wasn't just some lofty ideal either. It had a real impact on the intellectual climate. This openness to outside influences, this willingness to engage with diverse perspectives, really fostered this dynamic intellectual exchange that characterized that period in Islamic history.
A real melting pot of ideas. But hold on a second. He wasn't just blindly adopting everything that came his way. He was very much engaged with the contemporary Islamic thought of his time as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like he's trying to find that sweet spot, that space where he can reconcile these seemingly different intellectual traditions.
We see this really clearly in his views on divine attributes.
Right, his austere view, as the entry calls it. The idea that God is so absolutely one that ascribing multiple attributes to him implies a kind of multiplicity within the divine essence, which would compromise that absolute unity.
Which aligns really well with the Mutazilites, that theological school known for their emphasis on divine unity.
It's an interesting parallel, for sure. It suggests that Al-Kindi was not operating in some intellectual vacuum. He was very much aware of and participating in the theological debates of his day.
Yeah, like he's trying to find points of connection to build bridges between philosophical reasoning and religious doctrine. We also see this play out in his theory of creation, where he champions the idea of God bringing being to be from non-being. In other words, creatio ex nihilo, and rejecting the idea of an eternal creation.
Which again resonates with Mutazilite thought. They were also big on creation ex nihilo and very much against the idea of an eternal world, often using this to argue that the Quran itself was created rather than eternal.
And it's not just these abstract philosophical connections either. Al-Kindi actively engaged with Islamic scripture. The entry points out that he wrote a commentary on verses 36.7982 in the Quran, specifically to explain the concept of creatio ex nihilo. And in his Faisal to the prostration of the outermost sphere, he uses his cosmological framework to explain verse 55.6. It's like he's showing how you can apply philosophical thinking to deepen your understanding of religious texts.
It's a great example of how philosophy can be used not to undermine faith, but to provide a deeper, richer understanding of its core tenets. There's also this intriguing text on definitions, which might have actually been written by his students.
What's that one about?
Well, it's basically a glossary of philosophical terms. Like they were trying to create an Arabic philosophical vocabulary that would match up with the Greek terms they were encountering in these translated texts.
So they're trying to build a whole new philosophical language within Arabic. That's a pretty ambitious project.
It really was, but it was also super important. It was about making sure that these complex philosophical ideas could be expressed in a way that was accessible to Arabic-speaking audiences, laying the groundwork for a flourishing philosophical tradition in this new linguistic context.
Yeah.
It was about embedding philosophical discourse within their own culture, ensuring that it could take root and grow.
Okay, so we've talked about his background, his influences, his engagement with both Greek thought and Islamic thought. Let's shift gears and zoom in on some of his key philosophical doctrines, starting with, well, what else? First, philosophy. What's Al-Kindi's take on metaphysics?
It's pretty clear from what we've discussed so far that his metaphysics is deeply God-centered. He sees the study of God as the first truth and the cause of all truth, and that sets the tone for everything else.
So it's not just about being as being, like in Aristotle, but about God as the source of all being and truth.
Exactly. And the core concept that runs through his entire theological system is oneness. This idea that God is absolutely fundamentally one.
Which, okay, I get that. God is one. That's kind of a basic tenet of monotheism. But how does Al-Kindi actually argue for this? How does he get from philosophical first principles to the oneness of God?
He has this fascinating argument where he starts with the notion of oneness itself. He argues that to bring something into existence, to create it, is essentially to impose a particular unity upon it.
Okay, I'm following so far. Keep going.
And then he uses this analysis of Porphyry's categories. You know, those different ways we describe things like genus, species, difference, and so on.
Yeah, I remember those from my philosophy classes.
He meticulously goes through each of them, arguing that they all inherently imply both unity and multiplicity. Like, take a species. A species is one in its definition, but it applies to many individual members. So you've got this inherent tension between oneness and multiplicity built into all existing things.
And then what? Where does he go from there?
His point is that this tension, this combination of oneness and multiplicity within all created things, can't just be accidental or self-caused. It has to come from somewhere. There has to be a source of unity, a cause of oneness that exists prior to and beyond all these multiple things.
And that cause, that source of unity, is God.
Precisely. He argues that there must be a cause that is purely one, essentially one, or one in truth, and this is what he calls the true one, God.
Okay, but if God is this true one, does that mean we can't even describe him? Like, don't all our words and concepts imply some kind of multiplicity?
That's the interesting implication, isn't it? He goes on to argue that all these predicates, all these categories we use to describe things, ultimately don't apply to the true one. It exists beyond the limitations of human language and conceptualization.
It's like that idea from the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao.
Exactly. Al-Kindi's description of this true one as lacking matter, form, quantity, quality, and relation, being indescribable by any term that implies multiplicity, strongly echoes the Neoplatonic concept of the ineffable transcendent first principle. It's also reminiscent of Plato's forms. Just as the form of equality is pure equality, explaining why other things participate in equality, so Al-Kindi's God is pure oneness, the source and explanation of all unity in existence.
It's like he's trying to push the limits of language itself to point towards something that lies beyond our usual ways of thinking and speaking.
And that's always been one of the core challenges of philosophy and theology, hasn't it? How do you speak about something that ultimately transcends language? How do you point toward the ineffable without falling into the trap of conceptual limitation?
Speaking of limitations, let's talk about creation. How does this true one, this God who is pure oneness, actually create the world?
Well, he conceives of God as the true first complete agent, the one who brings things into being from non-being ex nihilo.
Ex nihilo out of nothing. Yeah, that's always been a bit of a head-scratcher.
It's not easy to wrap your mind around for sure, but Al-Kindi really emphasizes the uniqueness of God's creative act. He distinguishes between God as a primary agent and what he calls metaphorical agents, which are basically everything else in the created world.
Metaphorical agents, what does that mean?
Well, think about it this way. All other agents, whether they're humans, animals, or even the celestial spheres, they're always acting on things that already exist. They're limited by the materials they work with and the forces that act upon them. They're essentially intermediaries, secondary causes.
But God, as the primary agent, he's not limited in that way. He's the one who brings being itself into existence. He creates out of nothing.
Exactly. He's the source of all being, the ultimate cause. And this idea of mediated divine action is also important here.
Mediated divine action. So, like, God doesn't directly create every little thing, but he sets things in motion, creates these intermediaries that carry out his will.
That's the idea. And those intermediaries, they could be things like the world of the intellect, or maybe even the celestial spheres, acting as agents of God's providence, shaping the world according to his plan. It's a way of reconciling the idea of a transcendent God with his active involvement in the world.
Okay, so where does John Philoponus fit into all of this? We mentioned him earlier.
Right. His influence is especially apparent in this idea of creation without a pre-existing subject.
Wait, hold on. Doesn't creation always require something to be created, like a lump of clay for a potter or wood for a carpenter?
That's how Aristotle thought about it. He saw change as always involving a subject undergoing a transformation. But Al-Kindi, drawing from Philoponus, argues that creation ex nihilo is a unique kind of change, one that doesn't require a pre-existing subject. God's will alone is sufficient to bring being forth from non-being. It's a radical departure from the standard Aristotelian model.
And this leads into that whole debate about the eternity of the world, right? Whether the world has always existed or whether it had a beginning in time.
Exactly. This was a major point of contention between Greek philosophy and the Abrahamic traditions. Aristotle, as we mentioned, was very much on the side of an eternal world, while Al-Kindi, following Philoponus, argued against this.
But didn't Aristotle have some pretty solid arguments for the eternity of the world?
He did. But Al-Kindi cleverly uses Aristotle's own arguments against him. Aristotle famously argued that an actual infinity is impossible. Al-Kindi points out that if the world were eternal, then time, which is measured by the movements of the finite cosmos, would also have to be actually infinite. And that would contradict Aristotle's own principle.
Ah, I see. So it's like he's saying, if you're going to stick to your guns about the impossibility of an actual infinity, then you can't also hold on to the idea of an eternal world.
Exactly. But of course, Aristotle's not without a response. He could always bring up that distinction he makes between actual and potential infinities.
Remind me, what was that again?
Well, an actual infinity is like an infinite number of things actually existing all at once. A potential infinity is more like a process that can go on forever, but at any given point, you've only dealt with a finite number of things.
So like the natural numbers, they can go on forever, but at any given point, you've only counted to a finite number.
Precisely. And Aristotle could argue that the past eternity of the world is only a potential infinity. For any point in the past you pick, there's only been a finite duration of time since then.
So it's not like there's an actually infinite number of years that have already passed.
Yeah.
It's more like a process that could potentially go on forever.
Okay, that
Yeah.
makes sense. But Al-Kindi, once again drawing on Philoponus, has a counter-argument. He says that even to get to the present moment, an actually infinite number of past moments would have had to elapse. Like the infinite can't be traversed step by step. So if the past were truly infinite, We could never actually arrive at the present.
Huh. That's a pretty mind-bending concept. So is he saying that because we're here now in the present, the past can't be infinite?
That's the essence of his argument. It's a really intriguing line of reasoning and one that continues to be debated among philosophers today. Ultimately, whether it successfully refutes Aristotle's position is a matter of interpretation.
It's fascinating to see how these philosophical arguments can stretch across centuries, sparking new insights and challenges even today. Okay, let's move on from the vastness of the cosmos and the mysteries of creation to something a bit more, well, human. Al-Kindi's psychology.
All right, now we're getting into the realm of the soul, the mind, the inner workings of human beings.
And it seems like Al-Kindi, unsurprisingly perhaps, was a dualist, meaning he believed the soul and the body are distinct entities.
You got it. He has two main works that deal with this, that there are incorporeal substances and his discourse on the soul. And while they come at it from different angles, they both ultimately argue that the human soul is an immaterial substance, completely separate from the physical body.
So in that there are incorporeal substances, he's basically trying to prove that the soul is immaterial, that it doesn't have a physical form. How does he go about doing that?
Well, he uses Aristotle's categories as his framework. Remember those?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Sure. So the categories lay out these different ways we can talk about things: substance, quantity, quality, relation, and so on. And Al-Kindi argues that the soul, as the intellectual form of a living being, falls under the category of species. And since species are inherently immaterial, they're not physical things themselves, but rather concepts or forms, he concludes that the soul must also be immaterial.
Okay, so if I'm following correctly, he's saying the soul is like a blueprint, not the building itself. It's the form that gives shape and structure to the body, but it's not a physical thing in itself.
Exactly. However, the entry does point out a bit of a snag in his logic. He kind of conflates the individual soul with the universal species human.
What do you mean?
Well, his argument seems to imply that all human souls are essentially the same, that they all share the same form, which is the species human. But that doesn't quite sit right with our intuitive understanding of individual souls as unique and distinct.
So it's like he's saying we all share the same soul, which seems a bit off.
Yeah, it does raise some questions about the nature of individual identity and the soul's relationship to the body, but that's a whole other deep dive.
All right, so how about discourse on the soul? What's going on in that one?
Well, it takes a different tack. It presents a bunch of quotes from supposedly Greek authorities. I say supposedly because some scholars think they might not be authentic, but that's a whole other debate.
Okay, so what do these quotes say?
They all basically emphasize the soul's separability from the body and its ultimate ascent to the world of the intellect after death. It's a much more mystical and aspirational view of the soul compared to the more philosophical approach in that there are incorporeal substances.
It sounds almost like a religious text, like a sermon or something.
It definitely has that vibe. It's very much about the purification of the soul, preparing it for its journey to the higher realms. There is this emphasis on self-discipline, on turning away from worldly desires, very much in line with the ascetic practices common in both Christianity and Islam at the time.
So even though these two texts have different styles and approaches, they both ultimately agree that the soul is immaterial and survives the death of the body.
Exactly. And this dualistic view of the soul is really important for understanding Al-Kindi's epistemology, his theory of knowledge, and his ethics.
Okay, so let's talk about knowledge. How does a dualist like Al-Kindi think we acquire knowledge? If the soul is separate from the body, how does it connect with the physical world to learn about it?
This is where his treatise on the intellect comes into play. It's one of his most important works on epistemology.
And what does it say? How do we come to know things?
Well, first, he lays out these different types of intellect, drawing on ideas from Aristotle and the Neoplatonists. You have the potential intellect, the actual intellect, the acquired intellect, and then at the top of the hierarchy, the first intellect.
The first intellect, huh?
Yeah.
What's that all about?
It's kind of like this cosmic mind, the source of all intelligible forms. Remember those?
Wait, like Plato's forms?
Similar idea, but with a Neoplatonic twist. These intelligible forms, they're not just these abstract blueprints existing in some separate realm. They're actively emanating from the first intellect, illuminating the world and making it knowable.
So how do our individual intellects actually connect with these intelligible forms?
Well, Al-Kindi argues that our intellects are actualized by these external intelligible forms. It's like our intellects are these blank slates, and these forms from the first intellect come along and imprint themselves on our minds, making us actually understand things.
Okay, so it's not like we're just passively receiving sensory data and building knowledge from the ground up. It's more like our minds are being illuminated from above by this higher intelligence.
Exactly. It's a very intellectualist account of knowledge. It emphasizes the role of innate intellectual capacities and this external source of intellectual light, rather than just relying solely on sensory experience.
So it's more about remembering or recognizing these pre-existing forms than about creating new knowledge from scratch.
Precisely. And this idea is even more explicit in his work on recollection.
On recollection, what's that one about?
Well, it basically argues that we don't actually derive these intelligible forms from sensory experience at all. We remember them
Remember them from where?
from a prior state of existence before the soul was embodied. It's a very Platonic idea, this notion that true knowledge is a form of remembering, of recollecting these eternal truths that our souls were privy to before we were born.
Wow, so we're going full on Plato here.
It's a fascinating blend of Platonic, Aristotelian, and Neoplatonic ideas, all coming together to create a really unique epistemological framework. And even in his treatise on sleep and dream, which draws on Aristotle's naturalistic explanations for how dreams work, Al-Kindi still finds a way to incorporate the role of the immaterial soul.
How so?
He argues that during sleep, the soul, being separate from the body, can have these visions, these insights into the higher realms, and then it announces these visions to the imaginative faculty, which then translates them into dream imagery.
So even in dreams, it's the soul, not just the body, that's doing the real work.
Exactly. It's a way of integrating his dualistic psychology into his understanding of even seemingly mundane or physiological phenomena.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk ethics. What's the good life, according to Al-Kindi? How should we live?
Well, his most important surviving work on ethics is called On Dispelling Sadness. It's a really interesting text, kind of in the genre of philosophical consolation, where he's offering advice on how to overcome grief and find happiness.
And what's the key to happiness, according to Al-Kindi?
Unsurprisingly, it all comes back to his intellectualist framework. He argues that we should not place too much value on transient physical goods, things like wealth, status, or pleasure, because they're fleeting and ultimately unsatisfying.
So don't chase after material possessions or fleeting pleasures. Got it. What should we be pursuing instead?
He advocates for pursuing stable intellectual pursuits, cultivating the virtues of the soul, seeking knowledge of eternal truths. These are the things that bring true and lasting happiness, because they're not subject to the whims of fortune or the decay of the physical world.
It's all about aligning ourselves with the eternal, the unchanging, the realm of the intellect.
Exactly. And this ethical stance follows directly from his psychology and metaphysics. If our true essence lies in the rational soul, and if true fulfillment is found in the realm of the intellect, then attaching ourselves to perishable physical things will only lead to sorrow and disappointment.
So detach yourself from the material world, focus on cultivating your mind and your soul, and true happiness will follow.
That's the basic gist of it. It's a very intellectualist approach to ethics, but one that has resonated with thinkers throughout history, from the ancient Stoics to modern-day proponents of mindfulness and inner peace.
It's a fascinating reminder that even though these philosophical ideas were developed centuries ago, they still speak to us today, offering insights into the human condition that remain relevant across time and cultures.
And it's particularly interesting to see this intellectualist bent in Al-Kindi, considering his significant contributions to the physical sciences.
Hold on, what? I thought you said he was all about the intellect, the immaterial soul, eternal truths. How does that square with studying the physical world?
It's a good point, but it actually speaks to a really important aspect of his thought. While he believed that the most fundamental truths are intellectual in nature, not derived from sensory experience, he also recognized the crucial role of empirical observation and mathematical reasoning in understanding the workings of the physical world.
So it's not like he's anti-science. He just has this hierarchical view of knowledge, where intellectual truths are at the top, and scientific knowledge, while valuable, is ultimately grounded in those higher truths.
Precisely, and his work on optics is a great example of this. He was heavily influenced by thinkers like Euclid and Ptolemy, and he used geometry extensively to explain the mechanisms of vision. He even wrote a treatise called On Rays, de Radius.
On rays, what's that about?
Well, it's a really ambitious work, although some scholars question whether it's actually by Al-Kindi. But if it is authentic, it's a pretty mind-blowing attempt to explain all physical interaction through geometrical principles.
So like A grand unified theory of physics based on geometry? That's pretty wild.
It really is. It shows how committed he was to finding mathematical underpinnings for physical phenomena, even if the actual details of his theory haven't stood the test of time.
And it seems like this mathematical bent also pops up in his cosmology.
Oh, absolutely. He draws heavily on Aristotle and later commentators, but he always brings in this mathematical and geometrical perspective.
So how does that play out in his view of the cosmos? What's his grand scheme of things?
Well, he sees the cosmos as this highly ordered, mathematically structured system. He talks about the celestial spheres influencing the sublunary world, shaping the events that unfold down here on Earth. He even defends astrology as a rational science, arguing that it's grounded in real physical causes.
Astrology. So like the position of the stars at your birth can determine your personality or your fate.
Well, he's not saying it's some mystical or magical force. He's trying to explain it in terms of physical influences, like how the positions of the stars and planets can affect the weather and other natural phenomena, which in turn can influence humans.